Super. In the last video, we talked about putting inside observations. You can see that I put a couple more inside observations in my paragraphs. Remember, inside observations are to be words from the text. You don't have to put in the entire verse, just what you're going to be observing. And if it's more than 1 or 2 verses long, each paragraph should have at least one inside observation per paragraph. For some of the really small paragraphs, your paragraph title pretty much is the whole paragraph. Also, when you do your inside observations, you're going to want to observe the things that you see that are important, that the author thought was very important, that should be looked at deeply. So now you're going to move to your outside observations. Over here in this big white space, if you think of it just as a big white piece of paper. And you're going to be doing your outside observations. Now you're going to be looking at different observations that you think are really important. You're not going to make an observation on every single observation that you made for your insides. You're going to pull out the most important ones. I'm going to start out with the first one, who? Paul. Now, why? Because I think it's important that we know who it is that wrote this letter to Titus. It was Paul. Now we're going to talk about interpretations. Interpretation is, what did it mean to the original reader? Why was it important for the original reader to know this? Or maybe, what was the author's reason in putting this in? So for the interpretation, since we're just learning how, I'm going to start with a question. Why is this important to the original reader or the original audience? The original reader or the original audience are the people that received the letter. Remember, the books of the Bible are not written to us. They're written for us, but not to us. They were written to specific people or people groups. In the case of Titus, this letter was written to Titus. It wasn't written to you. So why is this important to the original reader? And then we have to answer in a way that we would think, how would the original reader be thinking about this? Perhaps it would be that Titus would be encouraged that Paul wrote to him, that Paul was thinking about him, and that Paul put his name on there. Also remember that all of these letters were read out loud to the church. So the people in the church would hear this. Titus wouldn't just keep this secret to himself, but he'd be reading this to the church. So you're thinking, okay, why would it be important to Titus that Paul put his name in there? Would it be important to the church that they knew that Paul actually sent this letter? So you're going to write out a question, and then you're going to write out the answer. Perhaps it would be, here's Paul, emphasize, servant and an apostle. Okay, now I have to fix my spelling errors. But why is it important to the original reader? Well, in the context of the false teachers, Paul emphasizes that he is both a servant and an apostle. And as such, he is the authority in matters of doctrine. Okay, I'm going to give you a chance to do yours. I'm just going to pause. Okay, so we're working on our outside observations and interpretations. You can see where the first one was Paul 1:1. The interpretation would be, why is this important to the original reader? Then you answer the question. In my case, I answered it in the context of false teachers. Paul is emphasizing that he is both a servant and an apostle, and as such he has the authority in matters of doctrine. Remember, the false teachers have come there and they've caused a lot of chaos in the church. And Paul has given Titus the hard job of trying to bring order there. Also, the next outside observation that I thought was important was a command to put in order what remains. Verse 1:5. Again, we put the verse references there so that you can look back and see, okay, does this fit? Or am I taking things out of context? Then the interpretation would be, why would this be important to the original reader? The false teachers were causing a lot of disorder through their teaching, and Paul is giving Titus the authority to bring order out of the chaos. And I think this would have encouraged Titus. Again, remember that interpretation is not what it means to us, but what it means to the original reader or the original audience. Remember, the people that have received this letter. I have another outside observation of a list. There's a lot of lists that show up in the book of Titus. This list was the older men, older women, younger men, and younger women. Chapters 2, verses 2 through 5. Now I ask a question about the author's intent. That's also an interpretation question. What was the author's intent in putting all these people on this list? The author is a very intentional guy, and I believe it was important for the entire church to know that they were part of bringing order to the church, and it wasn't just the job of Titus or a few chosen leaders. All of the church was to be part of teaching sound doctrine and bringing order. So again, with interpretation, we're taking information that we've known from the text, and we're saying, okay, what would this have meant in the middle of all this? What would it have meant to the original reader? Or what was the author's intent? And then we're answering it as best we can from the information that we have about what was going on in the church, and about what the people maybe were thinking, and maybe what they were struggling with. Now you can see, like here, I put who as an observation, and then I put interpretation. The next one I have the observation, and I didn't put interpretation next to it. You can format your outside observations and interpretations however you like. You can do it with bold, you can do it with a space, you can do it with labeling of observation interpretation. You can set it up however you want to, as long as you understand what it means, and as long as your staff person that's looking at your charts understands what you're saying. You want it to look so that they can see that it's understandable, that they can track your logic through the outside observations and interpretations. One of the things that I would encourage you to do is when you make an outside observation, that you have an interpretation with it. That way the interpretation stays tied together with the observation, and you don't go off on a tangent. Remember, the Bible is king, and we try to stick to the text as much as possible. In the next video, we're going to talk about timeless truths and applications and chart summaries for your charts.